All right, everyone, it's 12 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to start out by saying welcome. My name is Tammy Britton, and I'm the Workforce Development Project Manager with Talent 2025. I want to say thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today, we have the Talent 2025 webinar series, Commit to Hiring Returning Citizens. Session 1 is Move the Box and Start the Process to Expanding Your Talent Pool. For today's agenda, we will begin by introducing the topic and providing some context around the problem and one of the solutions. I will keep the topic introduction as brief as possible to allow maximum time to hear from today's guest employers. After that, we will move into employer stories regarding moving or banning the box. I'm joined by two guest employers today. We have Sarah Knuster from Mixed Staffing and Recruiting and Ellen Winterburn from Barfly Ventures. And then near the end, we will have some time for Q&A. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box as they come to you. And as a final housekeeping item, please mute yourself if you are not already muted. All right, allow me to briefly introduce you to Talent 2025. Talent 2025 is a CEO-led organization. We illuminate gaps, evaluate leading practices, and advocate for their implementation. This is all in order to make West Michigan a top 20 employment region by the year 2025. In part, we do this by addressing systemic barriers to the workforce. So being a returned citizen or a formerly incarcerated individual is one of those barriers to the workforce, as is having a criminal history. We address this barrier collectively through our Returning Citizens Committee, which is part of our Workforce Development Working Group. The committee objectives, as you see on the screen, are to increase the number of employers committed to hiring returning citizens and elevate the voice of business champions, raise awareness and highlight best practices for employers committed to hiring returning citizens, and finally, to increase the number of individuals exiting a correctional facility with a state-issued ID. So to bring it all together, the purpose of this webinar series is to educate and support employers regarding hiring returning citizens. To those familiar with the 2017 Community of Practice, which was held by Talent 2025, this is a further practical extension of that content. So we will have 3 sessions total, and each session will build on the next. First is today's, which is Move the Box. Next month in August is detailing individual assessments of criminal histories. And then in 2 months in September, we will discuss retention and success for returning citizens. So how do we first tap into this talent pool, determine fit for employment, get the right people in the door, and then enable everyone for success and retention? Unemployment is low in West Michigan. This graph on the left shows that West Michigan averages a 3.4% unemployment rate, with Ottawa County having the lowest unemployment rate at 2.8%. Also, the comparison chart on the right shows us a slow and steady increase in labor force participation rates. So unemployment is low, talent is hard to find, and more people are entering the labor force. Yet returning citizens are an underutilized source of talent who actually experience higher rates of unemployment. So reentry to the community after incarceration can be very difficult. There are 3 critical components for success. The first is social supports, and then housing, and finally employment. We know that 95% of incarcerated individuals will return home, which is 1,400 individuals annually returning home to West Michigan alone. The need for employment and reentry is essential. So the good news, though, is that we already have over 500 employers committed to hiring returning citizens in West Michigan, including the 2 that I have with me today. Now, a few more statistics before we move on to our employer stories for the day. As you can see on the screen, 1 in 100 people is incarcerated in the United States, and 1 in 20 children has a parent behind bars. And nearly half of U.S. children, so between 33 and 36.5 million, have at least one parent with a criminal record. So the inability to gain employment significantly increases the likelihood of recidivism, and then recidivism is expensive to everyone: families, communities, taxpayers. Recidivism also creates instability in families and in communities. It's also been estimated that excluding returning citizens with felonies from employment reduced the United States gross domestic product by $78 to $87 billion in 2014. This also hampers the ability of returning citizens to increase their individual tax contributions. So how can we bust some misconceptions? Well, 1 in 3 in the US have some sort of criminal record. More people in the US have a criminal record than a college degree. And despite this, there are many misconceptions about hiring returning citizens. In 2012, the EEOC made it clear that employers cannot use criminal histories to automatically disqualify candidates. That's because it's not always an indication of ability, qualifications, or a proper assessment of fit for the job. So the guidelines provide steps to ensure that criminal history is used in a relevant way during the hiring process. We will get to that more next month, but we do know that individual assessment of criminal histories can reduce misconceptions. So criminal records are actually fairly common, including those with felonies, yet these labels create fear. The fear often can be disproven. Many companies report success with hiring returning citizens. For example, Johns Hopkins Hospital conducted a study which found returning citizens to be, quote, good, loyal, and solid workers. A first step to committing to hiring returning citizens and expanding your talent pool is to move the box. This is also referred to as banning the box. This is the process to delay or remove questions about criminal history, particularly on the initial job application, and then comparing the nature of the job sought with the nature of the conviction. The first step can lead to an expanded talent pool. It can also improve retention rates and create overall safer communities. We know that excluding people with a felony or criminal background restricts an employer's talent pool, which has compounding effects in today's labor market. Hiring returning citizens can be incredibly beneficial to a company. For example, the U.S. military reports that people with felony convictions that serve in the armed forces actually get promoted faster. And our colleagues at the 32-2 initiative found that the turnover rate for returning citizens is actually lower than for non-returning citizens, comparing a 106% turnover rate to a 121% turnover rate, respectively. So to help us talk about what this actually means in the day-to-day life of companies, we're going to begin to talk about solutions. And today we have with us Sarah Canuster, the president of Mixed Staffing and Recruiting. And we also have Ellen Winterburn, the VP of Human Resources with Barfly Ventures. So welcome to you both.
Thank you very much, Tammy. So this is Ellen speaking, and I'm going to talk a little bit, first off, about Barfly Ventures and who we are in case you don't recognize the name. We're a local restaurant group here. We have several brands in the Grand Rapids area: Stella's Lounge, Grand Rapids Brewing Company, and Hopcat. And Hopcat is our location or our brand that we've expanded now into 8 different states and 16 different markets. So traditionally, we have hired people with criminal history backgrounds. So that itself is not an uncommon practice in our industry. What we decided to change consciously a couple of years ago was the decisions we were making on the types of crimes that we were hire people for. And as Tammy referenced earlier, this was an extension of the community of practice that I participated in with another of other local employers a couple of years ago. So what we did a couple of years ago is we decided that we were going to move the box, and instead of having it on our application form, it was going to then move to our background check form. We hand that background check form out after we give a contingent offer, and then we run the background check. So I have something that I'm just going to read briefly to you from our background check form that the candidate would be filling out. If you have a past criminal history, we want to hear the story from you, which means being open and honest with the hiring manager. Your past mistakes, criminal convictions, don't necessarily disqualify you from employment with Barfly Ventures. However, failure to disclose a thorough felony conviction history will. So when a candidate is filling out this form, we are asking them to tell us their story. We're giving them room to do that. And then the hiring managers have been coached to follow up on the form, double check to make sure if the candidate has filled out no on the felony conviction, so that's the correct answer. And if yes, then the manager's coached to ask them to hear more about the story, that we aren't necessarily black and white about hiring decisions, but that we want to make sure that we're making the best decision based on all information and all perspectives, not just what we'll get when we run a background check. And so that's been really helpful. A lot of times when a manager sends in a background check form to us to run, if there is something that they've discussed with the candidate, they're able to give us a little heads up and a little bit of prior knowledge of what's going on. So when we run that background check and something does come up, we have some context for the conversation. In addition, we have locations, as I mentioned, in a number of different states. And so there's a couple of differences related to what certain cities or states require. So in Minneapolis and Indianapolis specifically, they have a longer background check process for some candidates sometimes than others, and it can be for a number of just different reasons. Sometimes as simple as the person just has a common name and they're double checking it, or maybe they have some kind of a conviction and they're ensuring that the information they're giving back to us is correct. So what we've done on our background check form is we've asked them to give us the information that they have. If we go ahead and we make the hire, we let them know that if something does come up that they haven't been honest with us about, then that potentially could be an issue for not retaining employment. However, sometimes the process, as I mentioned, takes a little bit longer. We also have worked with our managers on interpreting the background check results, and it's really a collaborative process between our human resources team and the hiring managers. So many times the background checks will come back fine with no issues. Typically, if they were coming back with a drug conviction or DUI, that has been a normal hire for us. But when we looked at moving a couple of years ago to expanding that pool to the types of candidates, the types of crimes we'd be willing to consider, we then knew that we had to give some ideas to the managers on what those guidelines would look like. And so we tried to keep it simple for them. And because this is not a simple issue, we really have this standard of remember 3 and 3. So we try not to look back further than 3 years based on any types of convictions. And then we also look for patterns. If there's more than 3 occurrences of the same type of conviction, then we will say to the manager, maybe this is a person we don't want to take a risk on because they have a pattern here and they apparently have some difficulties with this particular issue. So that 3 and 3. Violence, sex crimes, and theft were typically crimes that we would stay away from. So prior to about 2 years ago, we would say if any of those came up, we'd say no thank you to the candidate. Again, though, we knew that we needed to be more considerate and thoughtful as we were looking through those types of convictions. And our hiring managers were really excited when we shared with them that we were going to be changing this, because what it meant for them is more candidates. And in today's market, that's just a really simple business reason to look at your practices regarding the hiring of returning citizens is just that. It's simple numbers and statistics and the number of people that you potentially would have to choose from. So what we've said to our managers when it comes to violence and sex crimes and theft, particularly violence and sex crimes, we're going to look at the individual situation, and that's where it's really helpful for the candidate to be as open and honest as they can about the issue. So we can look at the whole picture, not just at what the government is telling us has happened, but also the situation that the person was involved in. And I can give you a couple of examples. So we had a candidate a couple of years ago that was looking to be hired and came up with a felony conviction for not registering on the sex offenders list. And in talking to the candidate, we found out that he was homeless and he wasn't able to register because he didn't have a home address. Well, when we found out more about the original sex conviction related to why he even needed to register, we weren't concerned about it because of the time that had passed and the type of crime it was. And we decided that he was only going to be able to really continue his life and have success in life if he had a job, and he probably wasn't going to be able to find some kind of residency without a job. So we ended up hiring him, and that was a success story for us. But again, just at the initial look, you might have just said, oh, felony for failing to register on the sex offender list, and it would have been a no. But instead, looking a little bit further into the situation, we learned that it was, one that we were willing to take a chance on. The second story is not so much a success story, but I think it's important to share some of the failures we've had along the way and what we've learned from them. So sex crimes are particularly difficult convictions to really consider for a couple of reasons. One is they tend to be very emotional for people, especially if they have had some kind of an experience as a victim of a sex crime or a family member that was a victim of a sex crime. In addition, sex crimes have lists that have public knowledge to people. They're searchable. And so when new employees come into our restaurant, particularly managers, oftentimes the staff is Googling that person's name to see what's coming up. So we hired a manager last year that had a sex conviction. And while the decision to do so, I think, was solid, what we didn't do was really prepare the restaurant team for what that was going to look like. And so then once the staff members started finding out that this person had a sex conviction, they were confused. They didn't understand why we would do such a thing. And so the managers really had to spend a lot of time in reactive conversations with the entire staff, and then even with some of the local community members. And so looking back on that, if we were to do that again, I would certainly spend more time educating the management team up front, and maybe even just having a conversation with staff in general about our approach to background check hiring and to returning citizens. Of course, you need to be careful about balancing public knowledge with people's personal stories. Again, though, most of these situations are public knowledge, so we can't really just stick our heads in the sand and say, well, we're not going to talk about it. But you need to be respectful of the individual that you're talking about as well. So as you go along this journey, I think that's what you need to do, is consider it a journey. Understand that everyone in your organization is going to be on an individual journey themselves, while the company is on its journey to discover how they can do a better job of being inclusive and considering returning citizens, because it's the right thing to do for the company, for the individual, and for the community.
Great, thank you, Ellen. Can you describe for us how you have viewed the decision to hire returning citizens as something that's added value to the business?
Yeah, I think, there's the basic answer, which is numbers, because now we have more candidates to choose from. But it's also the fact that we're just being more thoughtful about individual situations and not making assumptions based on some things that come back on a background check form. And I don't know how many of the people listening have actually looked at a background check form, but it's not always the easiest thing to interpret, right? There's a lot of terms. Sometimes there's crimes that show up that I have no idea what they are, and I have to search for them. One of the examples that we have on our background check interpretation guidelines is felonious murder. So felonious murder doesn't mean that somebody committed a murder. It means that they committed a felony where a murder was occurred. So think the example of I was driving the getaway car for a robbery where somebody was murdered. I didn't commit the murder myself, but I was part of the crime with the murder at the scene. And so again, it's taking that extra moment to dive deeply into it and understand the whole story and not just what you're seeing on a piece of paper.
Yeah, thank you. I have seen a couple background checks, but you're right, they're confusing. You don't exactly know what they mean. At least I didn't know what they meant. So I think that's good advice. But what we're going to do now, if you have any questions for Ellen, feel free to type them into the chat box. I'll be checking that once we get to our Q&A section, our Q&A session. But what we're going to do is we're going to transition and hear the story from Sarah Knuster at Mixed Staffing and Recruiting. So Sarah, if you just want to go ahead and tell us about your process when it comes to moving the box or hiring returning citizens, go ahead.
Cool. So my name is Sarah Knuster, and I'm the president of Mixed Staffing and Recruiting. We are a certified woman-owned business, and I started the company in 2012 with the intention of helping educated women and minorities find employment. In 2013, I had a quote-unquote felon ask me to get them a job, and I said no originally, prayed on it, and was like, who am I to say that I won't give somebody a job? And then from there, started doing a program in the Kent County Jail and met some individuals who would share their story with me. And essentially, it was just like, holy cow, these are really great people. So we had, on average, about 20 people in the program, and we'd choose to employ the best 5. And from that practice, it really helped us rebrand our company to advocate for people who have been in the prison system. So we have an inclusive workforce staffing division where we will, again, advocate to employers to try to give them a shot Some of the processes that we go through are very similar to what Ellen said in terms of evaluating the crime. However, ours is quite a bit different because unless the recruiter's safety is in concern, we typically will work with anybody. Our job is to find the best people for the best organizations that they would fit well with. So it kind of gives us a benefit to have, 10 different options to choose from to say, hey, this person has these barriers, this company has this support system, and this is why we think they're going to work out really well in this organization. When we interview people, we start everybody out, whether they have a background or not, with the same process. So what they do is fill out an application or they send us a resume, and we just have life skills. So do they complete it fully? Do they show up on time to the interview? Are they dressed, professionally? Do they, do we have the job that they're looking for? And then from there, we'll dig into their background. And then what we look for on a background is honesty, details, and then their story. So similar to what Ellen was saying, is we're looking for, are they open about what happened? Can they give us background information of why it happened? And then we try to figure out, like, okay, well, if we were in that person's shoes, how would that happen? So I think as an employer, we really try to demonstrate empathy with everybody and just hear exactly what they're going through and or what they've gone through and how they've overcome what their background is. So that's kind of our process in terms of how we determine if we will work with somebody. We have not necessarily moved the box. That is something where we're not evaluating whether we're going to work with somebody based on their background. It's just we need to know for our clients in terms of what they can approve or not approve.
Can you give us an example of what that might look like when you're working with an employer who is hesitant to hire returning citizens and you try to advocate on behalf to make the change?
Yeah.
Returning citizen?
So kind of like what Ellen said, is that charge you might see comes up as, what is it? Felonious murder. A lot of times people don't know what that is. So educating the recruiters and then educating our clients. And so, there's that habitual offender that comes up often, but you might not look at the story of they were addicted to drugs almost all of their life, and now they've been sober for 5 years. And yes, they had a breaking and entering, but it was to, feed their children. And it's kind of just like figuring out what their story is and then sharing that with the company. One that we see often is a CSC or a sex offender, and a lot of companies are, no matter what, will not hire sex offenders or violent offenders. With that, again, we'll get their story. And so, a lot of individuals and stories that you'll hear, which are super sad, are interracial relationships where one person might have been 18 and the girl might have been 16, and the parents find out, and you're a registered sex offender for the rest of your life, and that it technically is rape, and you might have been in a relationship. I actually just am working to employ somebody right now that had that situation. So, I think just really hearing the story and then just figuring out how you can share that with employers. And some of it's super hard to figure out how to put it into words of, like, okay, here's what happened. And then you want to make sure that it's honest with what the person says. So.
Yeah. And I think you shared with us kind of how hiring returning citizens adds value, community-based value, but can you share with us some of the business added value you've seen from the employers who have committed to hiring returning citizens?
Yeah. So again, with what Ellen said, a numbers thing. So we see about a third of the talent pool increase for employers who will hire returning citizens. And so if you won't, if you think of it, a third of the talent pool that you're bringing in, you might be eliminating just because of your background policy. And out of that third, 50% of those people probably would have been really, really good employees and might have work history that is what you're looking for. So from a business standpoint, I think, when the unemployment rate is, what is it right now? 2 point something?
3.4 in West Michigan.
3.4 in West Michigan. And you're eliminating a third of that. Yeah, I mean, you're at a significantly lower percentage. And then I would just say, you know, from a community standpoint, if we, and I guess a business standpoint, if we lower our recidivism rate, our tax dollars go down. So we're not continuing to pay the $35,000 or whatever that costs per year to house somebody in our local Kent County jail or our prison system because they need employment to stay out of the system. So that would be my suggestions.
That's great. So I have one question for both of you. Something that I thought about when I was providing some context to lead up to your stories was, do you have any stories to talk about retention for returning citizens? This is something that we'll touch more on in the third webinar, but could you speak to good retention rates when committing to hiring returning citizens?
I can give an example. We had a gentleman who came to us. He was 56 years old and he served 32 years in prison and never had a job before in his life. And we employed him, and his background was pretty long and bad. He has since got hired in to the company, got promoted, I think 3 times, and has been there for 2 years. Our numbers seem to be relatively good when it comes to hiring returning citizens. Another one would be a gentleman. It was his first job that he got through us through the Kent County Work Release Program. He was 42 years old and never had a job before in his life. And he had 15 kids. And I remember looking at him and just saying, I don't think you're employable. And he also got a job. We've employed him twice. So the first time we hired him at a construction company and he was making $10 an hour. And he said he thinks it was God giving him a sign of like, you have to pay back for the 42 years of crime that you committed, which I don't agree with that. But that was a super hard job. And he got promoted several times. Because of child support, he was making, I think, like $20 an hour, but it ended up being 10 an hour. So that was a barrier. That was hard. But he was there for 2.5 years, and then we placed him. So he went from $20 an hour to placing him somewhere at $12 an hour. And he was like, well, at least I'm still making 50% of this. And since then, he's gotten promoted, I think, like 3 or 4 times, and he's been there for about 2 years, too.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
That's an incredible success story.
Yeah.
And what about you, Ellen?
I don't have any such specific stories. I think what we found when we started really looking at the numbers, that it was pretty similar to what we were saying in our general turnover for our industry, which is just typically high anyways, over 100%. But we have recently hired a couple of managers that have had convictions in their background. And so we'll be taking a look at, seeing what their progress looks like. And I think even for us, being able to showcase some of those stories within our own organization is really important. Again, with the person's permission, we don't want to just be talking about the things in their past, but if they're willing to share their stories. So I think that's the other thing, is you can't just go into this expecting these miraculous stories. Mm-hmm. You have to go into it knowing that it's going to be hard work. It's going to take some time. And if you start dabbling into it, putting your foot in the water, you will find those success stories, but it may take a little bit of effort.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you mentioned earlier, it's a journey.
It's a journey.
Right. And something that I think might be useful or helpful is just to mention what's been the hardest part about committing to hiring citizens. What has been the biggest adjustment, maybe, is a better way to phrase it.
I think, to start, I guess how we both started, it's not like it's a new thing, but it is more than just hiring somebody. So sometimes, we talk about in our company is we feel at times we're therapists and possibly like life coaches, and then maybe, resources in the community. Like you're more than just an employer giving somebody a job. But I think that comes with the population. You're going to help them in more than one area. So I would just say that, be prepared to say like, hey, you might see situations that you're not used to, or it's not a situation that you've experienced yourself, because maybe you grew up in a different environment. So I think just being open to hearing a lot of people who've been in the prison system can't get housing. So they might be homeless, or, they might have electrical issues. There's just so many issues that go along with not just giving somebody a job,
right?
But
so
just open.
Making the commitment, focusing on more of an asset than a deficit kind of perspective. Yeah, that's great. So what we can do now is we can go ahead and bridge into our Q&A session. I'm going to check the chat box to see if anybody's been putting in any questions. I have no questions at this point. Would anybody like to, you can either unmute yourself or go ahead and ask via the chat box for any questions for Ellen. Oh, I'm sorry, for Ellen or Sarah.
Hopefully we didn't put anybody to sleep.
Hopefully not. I think you guys did a great job. I don't think so.
Hi, this is Lisa Gavranovich at Zealand Lumber.
Oh, just a second. I hear a question, but my volume is down too low. Hold on. All right, go ahead and ask your question again.
Hi, this is Lisa from Zealand Lumber, and I love, Ellen, I love that you have that guide for how to interpret background checks. Right now, what we do is Google a lot of what we see or call our background check company. I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to share your guide on background checks with us.
Oh, absolutely. Hi, Lisa. It's so good to hear your voice.
Thank you.
Yes, now our guide doesn't have a lot of examples, it just has a couple, but you know, we could probably spend a little bit of time developing a more extensive guide, and then I could certainly provide it to Talent 2025 to send on to all of the members.
I think that would be incredibly helpful. We hear,
That's great.
and not just around this issue, but around other issues about employers being interested in navigating workforce development with more of a concrete handbook. So I can see that being really helpful. Are there any other questions? Thank you for your question, Lisa. I'm going to check the chat box again. All right, I see that Stephanie has a question. What's your question, Stephanie?
Are you guys able to hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Sometimes my volume's a little off. So we are definitely open to hiring people that have, you know, different backgrounds, and we have come into some circumstances where people have, you know, they have to sometimes report to, you know, maybe they have to go to court or they have to go talk to a parole officer. So sometimes it can affect the hours they work. And we weren't fully prepared with knowing that on our end, so that is our fault. But how do you prepare your managers and educate them so that they are understanding that maybe somebody, you know, maybe they don't have transportation, so the time of the shift might, you know, not fully work within their schedule, or maybe they do have to go report to a parole officer, so they need to leave for that. How do you prepare them and educate them so it doesn't come off more of the stigma?
Let's echoing.
There you go.
So for us, it's kind of a learning experience for both parties. But then also, if you can, you know, we always find out if they're on parole or probation, if we can get the contact information for their parole officer. A lot of times the parole officers will, you know, they'll be willing to work with employers because obviously they want to keep them employed. So maybe just, I guess, start in that area to try to get that contact information, because I believe, you know, I think they open at like 6:30 in the morning. So if your shift started at 6:30 and it goes until 3:30, they should be able to get to their parole officer outside of working hours. But I think just figuring out like when they have to be there, it usually should just be one day a month. And, you know, again, just working with maybe even the parole officer, but then use it as an opportunity to educate the employee on they need to have time management and they need to figure out when they need to get there, and whether it's they have a support system at home or however it is to get them to and from work. So if they are going to be late or they have, you know, they're going to have to leave a little bit early, they understand that they need to limit the amount of time. So yeah, I'm not sure if that was
No,
an
that-
answer
that-
to your
that helps.
question.
Thank you.
What about you, Ellen? How would you coach your managers for that situation?
Well, I would say that's actually one of the beauties to our industry is because most of our employees are part-time employees and we have, very changing schedules. It's really no different than, say, a student that can't come for a class. So I think it would just be more on the privacy issue of not sharing with other people that don't need to know why the person needs to have that time off. And also just providing Sarah was saying, the resources. I know there's some local resources here in the West Michigan area that can help with transportation. We also offer an employee assistance program, an EAP, to our employees because we're in so many different states. And so that's another resource for them. If they come to us with an issue that maybe one of us can't specifically address, that we recommend that they call and talk about what their issues, their need is, whatever the barriers that they're facing, and in the community that they're talking about, and see if the EAP can then provide resources in that local community for them.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to check the chat box one more time, or I do have my volume on. If anybody has anything they would like to ask. Oh, I have a question from Sarah. It looks like Sarah from DTE. She asks, as a company that staffs for other organizations, do you have any lessons learned if or when employees hear about an employee having blemishes on their BG, which
Background check.
background check. Okay. Do you have any lessons learned about when employees hear about an employee having anything on their background check?
I guess I want to make sure I understand your question. So if, like you were saying, they found out that they had the sex offender, they were on the sex offender list or whatever. Gosh, I would just make sure your policies are pretty strict. We did have one time, and the person's no longer there, but they would look at the sign-in list or the employees working, and then they would do that same thing. And we're just like, that's just not appropriate to look at somebody. You wouldn't do that to anybody else. So I think maybe just set the guidelines for the policies for your team and supervisors. Say, hey, it's not really, we'll let that be an HR thing, not so much a manager or production team to look at look at their Google. I mean, anybody can do that, but yeah, I don't know about you.
Well, I think the example that I shared about the manager that we hired with the sex conviction background, we've just basically said to our staff, look around you. We've got a lot of people that you work with, or maybe yourself, that has some kind of a background that maybe another employer may have said no thanks to.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're on this journey for everybody, not just one specific individual. And, by agreeing to work for Hopcat or Barfly Ventures, you're agreeing to be a part of our journey with us, which means you need to be accepting and understand our values and support those values, just like we support whatever your intentions is within the workplace. So I think having some pretty honest conversations with employees is pretty important because, again, a lot of this information is public knowledge, and we can say at work, we don't want you to do this, but who knows what they're doing in their personal time.
Yeah.
And we're so connected to each other through technology now that, avoiding it probably isn't going to be the best messaging.
And to kind of go off what you said, I mean, the statistic you just provided was 1 in 3 people have some sort of conviction on their record. So I think just knowing people make mistakes, they learn from them, but you don't judge people, and you don't decide to be, you're not the judge and jury that's going to say they can work in this environment or not. And if you want to do that, maybe you could start your own manufacturing or own organization to make those decisions. But yeah.
Right. And I think just the focus too on we're all trying to be productive members of the community together. And what are the expectations? So if we don't give somebody a job, do we think they're going to be successful?
Yeah. Right.
Do we not all deserve second chances as human beings? Yes, maybe there's different timing on when those second chances should occur, different scenarios where those second chances should occur. But again, if we'll say, a third of our staff at Hopcat has some kind of conviction, we gave them second chances along the way. What's the difference between giving someone else a second chance?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd see one more question in the chat. Oh, no, that looks like it's the same one. Oh, no, it's a different question. Do either of you work close with prisons to find talent?
Yeah, so we work with, I guess you would say halfway houses. So we've worked with the Kent County Jail, their work release program. We work with the state, Ionia State Prison. And then we work with CAP, which is a federal halfway house, meaning when they get out of federal prison, they go through this program to essentially get themselves ready to return to society. And then we work with alternative directions. I guess just knowing that if you do work with those groups, I think it's really great. Our federal prison system is really, really good in terms of how they bring people back into society. Our state, we have a lot of work to do here. I've heard people that they've dropped them off on the corner of Division and Franklin and said, good luck, good riddance. Our state system does a really good job of making sure that they have sustainable housing, that they have technology if they need that they do find a job, that they have a good support system here. And that would be the CAP program that we partner with.
So one of the things that I wanted to make people aware of is that within our state system, we have a lot of programs that people have the ability to go through, whether they're a long-term inmate or whether they're going to soon be a returning citizen. And for us specifically, there are some culinary programs at some of the specific prisons that our managers drool over, knowing that somebody's going to come out with some certifications that we prefer to have. So the challenge has been in finding connections, as Sarah said, to the state system specifically. But there are ways to get resume packets that come your way and to get notifications of specific programs. And so I don't have any great ideas off the top of my head for making those connections, but we can probably follow up and provide some other ideas for employers in the area.
Yeah, and as Talent 2025, we have some awareness of those as well. So that might be something that would be worthwhile for us to share.
Right.
And I would look at connecting to parole officers would be probably a good start, because they would be who their first contact is outside of prison as well. If it is, I mean, it's hard. The state needs, we need to have a better system.
Well, and I think the other thing to keep in mind, I actually had the opportunity to visit one of these programs at the system in Coldwater. And what some of the prisoners were telling me is that many of them recognize getting out that they need to start their lives over. So while they may be from the east side of the state or a particular area within the state, many of them are just looking for a fresh start. And so coming to West Michigan, they might be open to that because whatever led them to make the choices they did originally to get them into prison, they want to avoid those. So there's some opportunities to help relocate people to other parts of our state, including West Michigan.
Yeah. I'm going to check the chat box one more time. I don't think we have anything else in there. If anybody has an additional question before we move on, I still have my volume on. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or to type it in the chat box. I'll give that just another moment.
Then it's popped up on my email today. I know this is a far stretch, but my baby cockatiels got out the house.
I hear someone asking a question, but can you go ahead and repeat that?
And then all the neighbors were like, yeah, we'll keep watching out. Yeah, I know y'all know.
Maybe I'm hearing background noise. So if you do have a question, type it in the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on that. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and start wrapping things up.
Yeah, and I said the one that was really crazy today was, I know this is far stretch, but
So thank you for participating in the Q&A. We appreciate that. At this time, to wrap it up, before we end for the day, I'm going to ask you to please take some time to reflect on the content. And these 3 bullet points, we would like you to just take some time and think about. So when does your company ask for criminal history, and why? Is there a possibility for your company to change? And to be more specific to Talent 2025, why did you join this webinar? So we would love to hear your feedback. Please submit any answers to Tammy Britton at t.britton@talent2025.org. My email address is on the screen. We will take time at the beginning of the next webinar in August. So the next session to review answers, questions, and insights, just to recap today's topic of Move the Box and committing to hiring returning citizens. So in the meantime, watch for a follow-up survey. We will send you a follow-up survey. We want to know how to best provide relevant and useful content for you. Finally, a brief reminder about the next 2 upcoming sessions in Talent 2025's webinar series, Commit to Hiring Returning Citizens. August 28th, we're going to have the a deeper dive into the proper evaluation of criminal histories. And then on September 25, we'll look more closely at retention and success for non-traditional employees. So thanks again to Sarah and Ellen for joining us today. And thanks to all of you for spending your lunch hour learning more about hiring returning citizens. Enjoy your day. Thank you.